All right then, time to roll up our sleeves and delve into a bit of space history, eh? Specifically, we're going to have a good look at the Mercury Atlas 8 mission, or MA8 for short.
Right, right.
It was the fifth crewed space flight for the Americans,
It was indeed.
and the third time they'd managed to get someone up into orbit.
Absolutely a significant step.
Now, all this took place during a rather intense period, wouldn't you say? The space race was well and truly underway back in 1962.
It was a time of great tension and competition, that's for sure.
And the general consensus, I believe, was that the Soviets had something of an upper hand, particularly after those impressive long-duration flights they were pulling off.
Oh, absolutely. The Soviets were really setting the pace in those early years.
Vostok 2, for instance, managed a full day in orbit, which was quite a feat at the time.
A full day, can you imagine?
So our aim today, if you will, is to unpack the MA8 flight in a bit of detail.
Sounds good.
We're going to look at the goals they set, how it all played out, and the ultimate outcomes.
A deep dive.
Precisely. And it's particularly fascinating, I think, to consider this mission as a sort of technical evaluation, especially given the rather long shadow cast by those Soviet achievements.
It certainly puts it into perspective.
Now, we're talking about Walter M. Schirra Jr. at the helm of the Sigma 7 spacecraft.
A skilled pilot, Schirra was.
Launch day was the 3rd of October, 1962.
A date etched in the annals of space history.
And it's important to remember that this flight was very much intended as a stepping stone towards longer U.S. orbital missions.
It was a crucial step in bridging the gap, so to speak.
They'd already had those 2 3-orbit Mercury flights, MA6 and MA7.
Yes, those earlier flights were important, but they were just dipping their toes in the water, really.
And MA8 was meant to push things a bit further.
Exactly, to build up their experience and demonstrate that they could operate in space for extended periods.
So let's rewind the clock a bit and delve into the context surrounding this mission.
By all means, context is key.
We've already touched upon the fact that by 62, the U.S. had only managed those brief suborbital hops.
Little more than glorified up and down trips, really.
Whereas the Soviets, well, they had 2 full-blown orbital flights under their belts, including that impressive 24-hour mission of Vostok 2.
It made the American effort seem rather paltry in comparison.
It's safe to say the U.S. had some catching up to do.
Without a doubt. They needed to prove that they could match the Soviets in terms of orbital endurance.
And the Mercury program, using the Atlas booster, was their answer to that challenge.
It was their workhorse, the Atlas. A powerful rocket capable of lofting the Mercury capsule into orbit.
It wasn't simply about getting into orbit, though, was it? It was about staying there.
Ah, but that's the real trick, isn't it? Staying up there for a significant length of time.
And that's where the Atlas came in.
Exactly. It provided the muscle needed not just to reach orbit, but to sustain multiple orbits.
Now, the initial plans for MA8 were quite ambitious, weren't they? There was talk of 6 or even 7 orbits.
Yes, they were clearly aiming high.
A far cry from those earlier 3-orbit flights.
They wanted to show the Soviets that they were serious about long-duration missions.
It was meant to be an intermediate step towards that coveted day-long mission.
A clear signal of intent.
But the final decision to settle on 6 orbits wasn't simply a matter of ambition, was it?
No, not at all. There were practical considerations at play.
Those contingency recovery plans, for instance.
Ah, yes, those pesky logistical details.
They had to factor in all sorts of potential landing zones.
And make sure they could get to the capsule within a reasonable time frame.
A tricky business, especially with a longer flight.
Indeed. And it ultimately led them to choose the Pacific Ocean as the primary recovery area for the 6-orbit mission.
Which, of course, had significant implications for the tracking network and the deployment of those recovery assets.
A huge logistical undertaking.
But just as they were finalizing those plans, the Soviets decided to throw a spanner in the works.
Or should we say, launch another spacecraft.
Indeed. August 1962 saw the launch of not 1, but 2 Vostok missions.
Vostok 3 and Vostok 4.
And they completely blew the American plans out of the water.
They really did. The Americans must have been reeling.
Vostok 3 racked up an incredible 64 orbits.
An astonishing feat of endurance.
And Vostok 4 wasn't far behind with 48 orbits.
The Soviets were operating on a whole different level.
I can only imagine the scramble that must have caused back at NASA.
There must have been some frantic meetings going on.
I recall reading that they even briefly considered trying to shoehorn some form of rendezvous capability into a Mercury capsule.
Rendezvous with a Mercury capsule? That would have been quite a feat.
Desperate times, perhaps?
It was certainly a bold idea.
I suppose it was a sign of just how determined they were to catch up.
They were willing to consider all options.
But in the end, that idea was shelved, wasn't it?
It was, and probably for the best.
Safety concerns, I imagine, and the sheer complexity of modifying the Mercury design at such short notice.
It was a risky proposition, and they ultimately decided to stick with the original plan for MA8.
A wise decision, in hindsight.
It allowed them to focus on the mission at hand and gather valuable data without introducing unnecessary risks.
So, with the space race intensifying and the Soviets pulling further ahead, the focus of MA8 shifted somewhat, wouldn't you say?
It did indeed. The emphasis became less about matching the Soviets' endurance and more about thoroughly evaluating the Mercury spacecraft and its systems.
A more pragmatic approach, perhaps?
It was a sensible shift in priorities.
They needed to ensure they had a solid foundation before attempting even longer missions.
Absolutely. It was all about gathering data, refining their understanding of how the spacecraft performed in space.
And Schirra, as the pilot, had a very active role to play in this technical evaluation.
He wasn't just along for the ride, that's for sure.
He conducted a whole series of flight control experiments, really putting the Sigma 7 through its paces.
He was essentially a flying test pilot, gathering crucial data on the spacecraft's capabilities.
He even manually rotated the spacecraft to assess its handling characteristics.
Not the easiest of tasks, I imagine.
And then there were those yaw and pitch maneuvers, testing the attitude control.
Precision movements, essential for maintaining the spacecraft's orientation.
And, incredibly, he even realigned the onboard gyroscopes while in flight.
Now that's impressive.
It sounds like he was kept quite busy up there.
He certainly had a full schedule.
And I remember reading his assessment of the manual rotation. He described it as rather sloppy.
Sloppy, eh? That's not exactly reassuring.
Well, it gives you an idea of the state of the technology at the time.
They were still very much in the early stages of spacecraft design.
And it highlights the importance of those fly-by-wire systems that were being developed.
Automated systems that can provide a more stable and precise control of the spacecraft.
Schirra also spent a considerable amount of time simply letting the spacecraft drift.
Drifting. Sounds a bit like taking a break.
Not quite. There was a very specific purpose behind it.
Of course, there always is in spaceflight.
It was all about fuel conservation.
The constant battle to make those precious fuel reserves last as long as possible.
By observing how the spacecraft behaved in both automated and passive drift modes, they could gain a better understanding of its efficiency.
Crucial information for planning those longer missions they were aiming for.
And fuel efficiency was a major factor in this whole evaluation, wasn't it?
It was paramount. They needed to squeeze every last drop of performance out of those fuel tanks.
They had to be sure they could stretch those resources for those ambitious future missions.
It was a key constraint on their plans.
And the good news is that MA8 actually used less fuel than anticipated.
That's very encouraging news indeed.
A testament, I believe, to Schirra's skillful piloting.
He certainly played his part in conserving those precious resources.
Which boosted their confidence in the spacecraft's ability to handle those longer flights.
A significant step in the right direction.
No, it wasn't just the spacecraft itself that was being put to the test, was it?
No, the entire ground infrastructure was under scrutiny as well.
That worldwide tracking and communications network.
A vital lifeline for any space mission.
It had to be robust enough to handle a crewed flight of that duration.
It was a crucial test for the entire support system.
And how did it fare?
Overall, it performed admirably.
Good to hear.
It demonstrated that they had the capability to track and communicate with a spacecraft over extended periods.
A crucial step in paving the way for those future long-duration missions.
Absolutely. They were building a solid foundation for the future of human spaceflight.
Now let's talk a little about the Sigma 7 spacecraft itself.
A marvel of engineering for its time.
It wasn't simply a carbon copy of those previous Mercury capsules, was it? There were a few tweaks and modifications for this longer flight.
There were indeed several significant changes were made to accommodate the extended mission duration.
Let's go through those, shall we?
By all means, let's break it down.
Firstly, they removed the thermal blankets from the retro-rocket motors.
A weight-saving measure, I presume.
Exactly. Every little bit helped when it came to maximizing their endurance.
A constant trade-off in spacecraft design, weight versus functionality.
They also added a SOFAR bomb.
Yes, that ingenious device.
SOFAR, for those who aren't familiar, stands for sound fixing and ranging.
It was an underwater acoustic system used to help locate the capsule after splashdown.
An added safety measure, especially with a landing zone as vast as the Pacific Ocean.
It provided an extra layer of reassurance.
And then there were the upgrades to the reaction control system.
Those little thrusters that help control the spacecraft's attitude.
Precisely. They needed to be in tip-top shape for this longer mission.
ensuring they could maneuver and maintain the correct orientation in space.
And finally, they made some improvements to the communications equipment as well.
Keeping those communication channels clear was paramount for a mission of this duration.
It was their lifeline back to Earth.
The ability to communicate effectively with the ground crew was absolutely crucial.
So, a fair number of modifications to ensure Sigma 7 was up to the task.
They were leaving no stone unturned in their preparations.
And what about the Atlas booster itself?
Yes, the workhorse that got them up there in the first place.
How did it perform on this particular mission?
By and large, it performed as expected.
Which is good news, considering its crucial role.
It successfully delivered Sigma 7 into the intended orbit.
There were a couple of minor hiccups, though, weren't there?
There were a few anomalies, yes.
A momentary roll transient at liftoff, for instance.
A bit of a wobble, but nothing too dramatic.
And then there was the slightly below normal sustainer engine thrust, coupled with higher fuel consumption than they'd anticipated.
That does sound a bit concerning.
It seems they suspected a fuel leak might have been the culprit.
That would certainly explain the higher consumption.
But despite these issues, the Atlas did its job.
It did indeed. It got them safely into orbit, which is ultimately all that matters.
They'd also made some modifications to the Atlas prior to this flight, hadn't they?
They had, in an effort to improve its reliability.
There were those baffled fuel injectors, for instance.
Those were designed to address some of the combustion instability problems they'd encountered in earlier Atlas flights.
And then there was that new hypergolic fuel igniter,
A more reliable way to get those engines firing.
all aimed at making the Atlas a more dependable launch vehicle.
They were constantly refining the technology, learning from each flight.
And it seems those efforts paid off, despite those minor anomalies.
They did. The Atlas proved itself to be a capable launch vehicle.
So overall, a successful launch, albeit with a few heart-stopping moments.
A bit of drama is to be expected, I suppose, when you're pushing the boundaries of technology.
And once they were safely in orbit, the real work began.
The technical evaluation was the primary focus of the mission, after all.
Now, 6 orbits might not seem like a particularly long time by today's standards.
No, but back then, it was a significant step forward.
A far cry from those earlier 3-orbit missions.
It allowed them to gather much more data on the spacecraft's performance over an extended period.
So what did Schirra actually get up to during those 6 orbits?
Well, as we've discussed, he was kept busy with those flight control experiments, really putting the Sigma 7 through its paces.
Testing those manual controls, for instance.
Seeing how the spacecraft responded to his inputs.
And battling that pesky overheating issue with his pressure suit.
Yes, that unfortunate incident.
He had to adjust the suit's cooling and adapt his activities to manage it.
A testament to his adaptability as a pilot.
And then there were those scientific observations he was tasked with.
Trying to gather some data on the Earth and the space environment.
But those didn't go quite according to plan, did they?
Not entirely. The weather wasn't particularly cooperative.
Cloud cover scuppered most of those attempts.
A frustrating setback for the scientific objectives.
He was trying to observe those flares and use the xenon lamp, but to no avail.
The clouds got in the way.
But he did manage to confirm those fireflies that John Glenn had reported during his earlier flight.
Those strange, luminous particles that seemed to surround the capsule.
It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless.
It added to the growing body of knowledge about the orbital environment.
And the engineering tests continued unabated, didn't they?
They were the primary focus of the mission, after all.
Yaw and pitch maneuvers, gyroscope realignment, all meticulously executed and recorded.
Gathering valuable data on the spacecraft's performance.
And he even had a go with the periscope.
The periscope, eh? That sounds interesting.
Not particularly successful, though.
Oh, what was the problem?
It seems he found it rather difficult to use.
I suppose the Mercury capsule wasn't exactly designed for panoramic views.
It was cramped in there, and those small windows didn't help.
Not ideal for sightseeing.
But even those periods of drifting weren't simply downtime, were they?
No, they made use of every available moment.
Schirra conducted spatial awareness and motor control tests during those drifts.
Assessing how his body reacted to the microgravity environment.
And he also managed to squeeze in a light meal.
Demonstrating that astronauts could indeed eat in space.
Though I doubt it was a Michelin star experience.
Probably more akin to airline food, I imagine.
And he had his trusty camera with him, didn't he? Attempting to capture some images of the Earth.
A bit of early space photography.
How did that go?
Mixed results, I'm afraid.
That's a shame.
Some of the filtered images for the U.S. Weather Bureau turned out okay.
At least there was some success there.
But those conventional color photographs, well, they suffered from the same cloud cover that hampered the scientific observations.
Plus a few exposure issues, it seems.
Not the ideal conditions for photography.
But it was all part of the learning process, wasn't it?
Absolutely. They were constantly refining their techniques, figuring out what worked and what didn't.
And then right towards the end of his orbital stint, there was that rather unusual request.
Oh, yes, that Spanish statement business.
It came out of the blue, didn't it?
Right near the end of the fifth orbit, just as he was starting to prepare for re-entry.
He was asked to deliver a message in Spanish.
Now, why would they ask him to do that?
It seems it was a public relations request.
A bit of an odd time to be thinking about PR, I'd say.
Schirra wasn't too pleased about it, understandably.
He was trying to focus on getting home safely. And here they were asking him to deliver a speech in another language.
But despite those distractions and the minor setbacks, the 6 orbits were deemed a success, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. They achieved what they set out to do.
They confirmed the spacecraft's capabilities and demonstrated that they could operate for an extended period.
And they used less fuel than expected, which was a bonus.
It was a significant boost for the Mercury program, even if the Soviets were still outpacing them in terms of endurance.
It was a step in the right direction, proof that they were making progress.
Now, let's turn our attention to Schirra himself.
The man at the helm of Sigma 7.
He wasn't just a passive passenger, was he?
No, not at all. He was an integral part of the mission, a skilled pilot who played a key role in its success.
His role in that technical evaluation was paramount.
He was instrumental in gathering that crucial data on the spacecraft's performance.
He executed all those tests with diligence and precision.
And his piloting skills were evident throughout the flight.
Particularly that fuel-efficient stabilization after separating from the Atlas booster.
That maneuver demonstrated his expertise as a pilot, his ability to conserve fuel while maintaining control of the spacecraft.
It set the tone for the entire mission, really.
It did. He was clearly a master of his craft.
And we've already touched upon the scientific aspects of the mission, which, unfortunately, were somewhat limited by those pesky clouds.
A reminder that even the best-laid plans can be thwarted by the winds of nature.
But Schirra's contributions on the engineering front more than made up for it.
He was a valuable asset to the team, providing crucial insights into the spacecraft's performance.
And let's not forget that overheating issue with his pressure suit.
A rather uncomfortable experience, I imagine.
He handled it like a true professional, though.
He did. He adjusted the suit's cooling system and modified his activities to manage the situation.
A testament to his resilience and his ability to adapt to unexpected challenges.
Astronauts need to be able to think on their feet, and Schirra certainly demonstrated that ability.
And his rather blunt assessment of the manual control system, sloppy, he called it, was quite telling.
It highlights the challenges they were still facing in those early days of spaceflight.
The technology was still in its infancy, and they were learning as they went.
It was a constant process of iteration and improvement.
And that Spanish statement request, well, that clearly wasn't appreciated.
It's understandable that he was frustrated by that, given the critical phase of the mission he was in.
He had more important things to focus on than public relations.
His priority was getting home safely, and rightly so.
But despite those frustrations, he brought Sigma 7 home with remarkable precision.
A perfect splashdown just half a mile from the recovery ship.
The USS Kearsarge.
An impressive feat of navigation.
It was a textbook re-entry and recovery.
A culmination of all their hard work and preparation.
And he even made an interesting observation after the flight regarding some bruising on his hand.
Bruising? From what?
It seems he'd got it from the hatch switch.
Ah, and that tied in with Grissom's Liberty Bell 7 incident, didn't it?
It did indeed. It lends some credence to the theory that Grissom might have accidentally triggered the explosive hatch on his flight.
Which had been a point of contention at the time.
Schirra's observation suggested that it was possible to inadvertently activate the hatch.
An interesting piece of the puzzle.
Now, for all the excitement of being in orbit, it seems Schirra wasn't particularly blown away by the view of Earth.
Really? That's surprising.
He likened it to high-altitude flights he'd experienced in his career as a pilot.
Perhaps the relatively low orbit of the Mercury flights didn't offer the same sense of perspective as later missions.
It's possible. Or maybe he was just a hard man to impress.
He was a seasoned pilot, after all. He'd seen a lot from the cockpit.
But he did have high praise for the Sigma 7 spacecraft itself.
Well, that's good to hear. It seems they built a good machine.
He ranked it highly among all the aircraft he'd flown.
High praise indeed, coming from a pilot of his caliber.
So, a successful mission, both in terms of achieving its objectives and in Schirra's personal experience.
A significant step forward for the U.S. space program.
And yet, the public and political reaction was rather muted, wasn't it?
It was, overshadowed as it was by the unfolding Cuban Missile Crisis.
The world was on the brink of nuclear war, and a 6-orbit spaceflight suddenly seemed rather insignificant in comparison.
It's a stark reminder that even extraordinary achievements can be eclipsed by world events.
But Schirra's contributions were recognized, weren't they? He received the NASA Distinguished Service Medal.
A fitting tribute to his skill and professionalism.
And he was even approached about a possible career in politics.
Robert Kennedy, no less, inquired about his interest.
But Schirra declined, preferring to stick with his first love, flying.
A wise decision, perhaps. He was clearly a man who loved his chosen profession.
And of course, MA-8 served as a vital stepping stone towards that longer MA-9 mission.
They incorporated the lessons learned from MA-8 into the design and planning for MA-9,
making further weight-saving modifications to extend the spacecraft's endurance.
They were constantly pushing the boundaries, striving for greater achievements.
And the legacy of Sigma 7 lives on, doesn't it? It's currently on display at the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex.
A tangible reminder of those pioneering days of human spaceflight.
A piece of history that visitors can marvel at and appreciate the ingenuity of those who designed and built it.
It's a testament to the human spirit of exploration and our desire to push beyond the limits of what's possible.
So, to sum it all up, MA-8 was a crucial technical step forward for the U.S. in the space race.
It demonstrated their growing capability for extended orbital flight and boosted their confidence in their technology.
It wasn't about breaking endurance records, but about laying a solid foundation for future missions.
About refining their understanding of the challenges and complexities of operating in space.
And as we've noted, missions' achievements were somewhat overshadowed by the geopolitical events of the time.
A reminder that even the most extraordinary feats can sometimes be lost in the noise of world affairs.
But those who worked on MA-8, and Schirra himself, deserve immense credit for their contributions.
They played a vital role in advancing the U.S. space program and paving the way for those iconic missions that followed.
So, as a final thought for our listeners today, consider this. It's often those seemingly technical missions, the ones that don't grab the headlines, that are the most crucial.
The ones that lay the groundwork for the groundbreaking achievements that capture our imaginations.
They might not be as glamorous, but they're the unsung heroes of the space program.
The missions that test the technology, gather the data, and push the boundaries bit by bit.
So let's raise a glass to those unsung heroes, the engineers, the technicians, the flight controllers, and the astronauts like Walter Schirra,
who, through their dedication and hard work, made those giant leaps for mankind possible.
And let's not forget that even today, those seemingly small technical steps are being taken,
pushing the boundaries of what we know and what we can achieve,
laying the foundation for those future missions that will inspire generations to come.
The journey continues, and it's built on the backs of those who dare to explore the unknown.
And on that note, we'll bring this deep dive to a close.
Until next time, keep looking up at the stars.
And marveling at the wonders of human ingenuity.
And who knows what incredible feats we might witness in the years to come.
I, for one, can't wait to find out.
Nor I. It's an exciting time to be following space exploration, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. The future is out there, waiting to be discovered.
Indeed. And who knows what wonders we might uncover.
Perhaps one day we'll even venture beyond our solar system.
Now that's a thought to ponder.
A tantalizing glimpse into the possibilities that lie ahead.
Until then, we can only dream and imagine.
And keep exploring the vastness of space, one mission at a time.
Quite right. Each mission, no matter how small, brings us one step closer to unraveling the mysteries of the cosmos.
And that's a journey worth taking, wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. A journey that will continue to inspire and amaze us for generations to come.
And with that, we bid you farewell for now.
Until our next deep dive into the annals of space exploration.
Goodbye and Godspeed.